Dr. Archibald will do her presentation, and then we will have 8 to 10 minutes for a conversation between her and I. And then at the end of all of that, 20 minutes for Q&A from all of you. And just in managing the chat room, we want to let you know that this is also being recorded and it will be saved at the end of the session. And we're asking people not to have side discussions because it's a real distraction to those of us who are managing it. And this is a little known fact that I just learned myself, that the so-called private communications that we do in chat also get saved, and it's seen by the hosts. So if you think you're having a private conversation with someone, you're not really. So we're asking you to please use the chat at 2 times at the beginning, as I just asked you, if you could say where you're from and what lands you are on and what land you're zooming in from. And the second time is during and after Dr. Archibald's presentation and during our conversation. If you have questions or ideas that you would like to put forward, we'd like to ask you to do it then. We're wanting to be respectful of people's time and address the questions and the ideas as they are put here. And Robert will be keeping track of that. So he's attempting to keep me in order. And just to give context for this webinar series, these webinars are intended to reflect the intent of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and SFU's response to that, and to respect the recommendation of SFU's Aboriginal Reconciliation Council. So in the spirit of nothing about us without us, which is in that report, we are hopeful that through these webinar series, we will provide insights to Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators, staff, and students on the many facets of decolonizing and indigenizing in the Academy. Now, I'm sure many of you already know this, but a critical approach was taken to Indigenous education starting in 1972, when there was a movement for Indian control of Indian education. It was a response to a 1969 white paper from the Liberals. You can Google that and you'll find all the information you need for that. And for decades, Indigenous scholars have worked tirelessly with critical non-Indigenous scholars to carve out a space in the Academy and to develop Indigenous theories from our unique knowledge systems, which are complex, relational, and include aspects of many disciplines because of the holistic approach. These Indigenous theories reflect Indigenous teaching and learning practices. So this series will provide an opportunity to intersect all those knowledge systems and explore how, when, and where Indigenous ways of teaching and learning can be used in the development of curriculum for all disciplines, and how it will enhance learning experiences of faculty, staff, and students. So just a brief introduction to Dr. Archibald Kwam to start this series at the Center for Educational Excellence here at SFU. And full disclosure, Dr. Archibald was my supervisor during my PhD program. I was so blessed to be able to work with her. And we are completely blessed that she's taken time away from her golfing and her grandchildren to come here to be with us today. And you will all have read her bio on the website. You will know that there are many more recognitions that she has received beyond what's listed there on her bio. So her expertise in Indigenous education is recognized internationally, nationally, provincially, and of course amongst her Stolo and Statlium peoples. So I am blessed to introduce Dr. Archibald.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you everyone for joining in today. This is very exciting. So I'm turning on my share screen and let's see how this works. I think we're all set. So I'm sharing some stories and perspectives from my experience, 45 years plus, I guess, in relation to decolonizing and indigenizing the Academy. As I sit here today in Vancouver in Kitsilano, I'm on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And Yehukwa Asai to Marnie for welcoming us from Musqueam perspective. Good to see you here today. Here's the next one. Let's see if this works. I want to start out with the first part of this presentation, focusing on decolonizing education. So I have here quotes from two Indigenous scholars who have written and lived this notion of decolonizing education. Marie Baptiste talked about the importance of questioning Eurocentric assumptions about education and really learning about and thinking about the impact of the various tragedies and indignities of colonial education, broadly thought of as education, has placed on Indigenous people. So that important area of questioning the impact of Eurocentric assumptions, philosophies, methodologies, theories, approaches is a very important step. Then I look towards Linda Tuai Smith, a Maori scholar, and she talked about that decolonizing education must offer a language of possibility, a way out of colonialism, so that we can make strategic choices, theorize, do our actions, and to pose our alternatives from within Indigenous worldviews, perspectives, Indigenous knowledge systems. And I also looked to important people who have taught me things. And one of those is my 7-year-old grandson. And he taught me this when he was 6 years old. Last year, he started grade 1. And we spent a fair amount of time together, kind of learning, playing. And I don't know, we might have been having a little problem with something. And he calls me Cecila as a grandmother. And he says, Cecila, you have to do the hard work first. And said, do the hard work first, and then maybe it'll get easier afterwards. And I thought, wow, isn't that an important understanding, to do the hard work first? So when I think about decolonizing education, then I thought, well, then I must look at myself. So I'm going to share my personal story about doing the hard work first. And I'm going to tell the story so I don't have to move the slide. So it'll stay on this slide while I'm telling this story. So in my public schooling experiences from elementary to high school, there were very few times where we learned anything about Indigenous people, and those were not positive experiences for me. I recall stereotyped images of Indigenous people who were presented as warring, quote, savages. There was nothing positive about Indigenous history or culture. Imagine the impact of these perspectives on all students, but especially Indigenous students. But somehow, through all of those years of public schooling, I was among the 4% of an Indian, that's what's term used, of Indian students who graduated high school in the late 1960s. Imagine, among the 4% who graduated high school. And this is according to that figure, that data, from the national study conducted by Harry Hawthorne around 1967. Indigenous content was not included in my Bachelor of Education degree, which I completed in 1972, nor in my Master's of Education degree, which I completed in 1984. And I give you those dates just so you get a sense that through this kind of schooling from K to 12 into university, there was nothing to very little of indigeneity included. But I focused a lot of my assignments on relevant Indigenous topics, even though it wasn't in the courses. It was in my master's final project that I started to read historical accounts of Indian residential schools and colonial history. Through this reading and self-reflection, I gained some understanding of the intergenerational impact, colonial impact on my family and other Stalo communities, such as the mistrust that many Indigenous people had toward education, on the social, emotional health, and other issues that they were experiencing. In my PhD program, which I completed in 1997, I had one course opportunity to focus on Indigenous education, and that was through an independent study. But I focused my doctoral research on the development of an Indigenous theoretical, methodological, and pedagogical framework that I called Indigenous story work. At that time, I had read whatever was available on indigeneity, which was not a lot, but it was enough to help me. I also used my professional work experience as a teacher, curriculum developer, and university leader for critical reflection. In my graduate studies, I became critically aware of the predominance and impact of colonial laws, such as the ban on potlatches and ceremonies, how land and resources were stolen or taken away from Indigenous people, how the federal government crafted legislation through the Indian Act that imposed many restrictions on how Indigenous people lived and were governed. Learning colonial history is difficult, emotionally draining, but necessary for moving forward. This learning is doing the hard work first. For me, doing the hard work continues. Through all this learning, I experienced anger, frustration, hopelessness, and sadness. But I also experienced hope when I talked to elders and cultural knowledge holders who are able to keep their Indigenous knowledges and values and teachings and languages in their hearts and minds, despite colonial attempts to obliterate them. I listened carefully to these stories with the 3 ears. Of course, 2 we hear with, but the 1 in our heart. I also read their scholarship. These folks demonstrated resilience and resistance to colonialism. I am thankful to these scholars and other allies who worked together to create scholarship from Indigenous peoples' perspectives and stories. So in doing the hard work first, I learned maybe 4 major things that had to be done. And that is to learn the local, for me it was Stalo, even though I grew up on a reserve in a Stalo community, I needed to know more about the colonial history that Stalo people experienced in a way I lived it, my family's lived it, but we had to figure out how this colonialism happened, how it worked, what impact it had. And then, of course, extend that to BC and Canada. And doing this kind of difficult learning, it's important to recognize the intergenerational impact. You know, I looked at my family members, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and tried to see, you know, that how various issues about family closeness, you know, how that was disrupted over the generations. Along with that, engaging in questioning, that critical self-reflection, and then using Indigenous stories and perspectives to tell the Indigenous history. All of that helped me do the hard work first. Okay. So moving on to Indigenizing the Academy then. My colleague, Dr. Jan Hare, and I looked at Indigenous education across Canada, and we did, again, a reflection 20 years after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which that report released in 1996. You know, that was a major national study which involved Indigenous people engaged in research. And many people talked about their various experiences, and RCAP, you know, examined the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. So, so what we, you know, thought a lot about this notion of indigenizing the academy or indigenizing education, you know, really involves transforming the university through Indigenous knowledge approaches. And Indigenous knowledge is very encompassing of values, teachings, languages, pedagogies, content, and assessment. Now, the next story I want to tell, which relates to Indigenizing the Academy, is really this story called Raven's Call, which is a NITEP story. And, you know, it's about an Indigenous teacher education program that was established in 1974, you know, by a handful of Indigenous educators and a couple of non-Indigenous faculty allies at the UBC Faculty of Education. Now, if you look at the logo of Raven holding the sun in its beak, you know, this logo comes from, you know, many stories told along the northwest coast of BC, where Raven, often a trickster character in our stories, often gets into trouble when ignoring the good teachings, but once in a while, Raven does a really good thing. Anyway, Raven took pity on the people who were living in darkness. And Raven had heard about something called the sun, which gave off bright light. And he wondered if he was able to get the sun to the people living in darkness, maybe they'd have a better life. So Trickster took off on this long journey and captured the sun and brought it back to the people who were living in darkness. Well, the handful of people who started NITEP chose this symbol to not only as the logo for NITEP, but as a symbol of the vision of the program, where education could be like the sun, providing a better life for people through education. Now, NITEP, I mentioned, was established in 1974 at a time when, you know, the aim of education was really assimilation. But NITEP was established as a program for Indigenous people. It wasn't to assimilate them, but it was to prepare them to be good teachers, to provide, you know, a good quality education to all children, but especially Indigenous children. And the program met all the degree requirements for a Bachelor of Education, but added to the program were a number of Indigenous courses and teaching experiences, and importantly, that half of the program was to be completed at a regional community-based site in partnership with local Indigenous communities. So that was an important program, and I am very thankful to those educators and the allies at the time who got this program approved through, you know, a very conservative university, and NITEP has been going for 46 years now. Well, when I began my work with NITEP in 1981, I was a sessional lecturer, and I helped revise and develop Indigenous education courses where we looked at educational policies, curricula, historical, contemporary laws, and other policies aimed at Indigenous people. And in 1980, Verna J. Kirkness, an Indigenous scholar, became NITEP's first Indigenous director. And what she did was to, you know, challenge the university's hiring appointments and policies. And she ensured that Indigenous educators taught the Indigenous courses. And myself among them, you know, we had teaching experience, we had knowledge about Indigenous cultures and languages, and we were able to work together as a group too, to share our experiences in teaching the Indigenous courses. And, you know, we felt it was important that the Indigenous courses would have a safe learning environment where students could deal with their emotions, have frank discussions about what was happening in their families and other communities, and then develop teaching ideas to help them deal with this colonial intergenerational impact, especially when they became certified teachers. And NITEP students had course opportunities to learn more about their own Indigenous cultures and identities, and then to learn about others' cultures. A range of Indigenous knowledge existed amongst the NITEP students. Some knew their language, knew their traditions, while others did not. They did not have the opportunity, maybe because they were fostered, adopted out, or disconnected, you know, from their traditional community. So we felt it was important that they have that opportunity to learn not only colonial history and impact, but to develop their sense of indigeneity. So Raven's call for education to serve Indigenous learners and their communities in better ways has required systemic change to a university and a faculty to ensure that Indigenous courses, a program structure, hiring policies, admission requirements, and Indigenous student services result in good quality education so that we can celebrate, you know, the decolonizing and indigenizing within an Indigenous program. So over my 45-year plus education and career, I have experienced and been involved in many changes to Indigenous education at all levels. Moving from educational environments steeped in assimilationist goals and approaches to those that value self-determination, nation building, Indigenous knowledge systems, and reconciliation has been a fulfilling journey for me. So this slide shows Indigenous symbols of programs, places of learning, and teachings, where some of the hard work of decolonizing and indigenizing the academy has taken place with varying degrees of success. It is important to recognize that there are educational environments and disciplines in the academy that are still assimilationist, racist, and unjust for Indigenous people. At the same time, there are many more Indigenous people and non-Indigenous allies working and studying within academia who are committed to making academia a more respectful and responsible place. They have done the hard work first. Today, there are many examples of books and journals, films, multimedia resources, courses, workshops, Zoom sessions to guide those who are starting out on this journey and to boost those who need a helping hand. Artists, Indigenous leaders, and storytellers have talked about Thunderbird Rising, and that's what's on the other slide, Thunderbird Rising. And Thunderbird, you know, is a symbol of the most powerful supernatural being in our Indigenous stories. So Thunderbird Rising gives hope to continuing and strengthening these decolonizing and indigenizing efforts within Academy. So I conclude this presentation, you know, with this slide about Thunderbird's challenge. When we think about people involved in academia, if you recall in the to do the hard work first, the four major strategies that I summarized there, I think these help us develop this critical awareness, those strategies. Learn local BC Canadian colonial history, recognize intergenerational impact, engage in critical self-reflection, and use Indigenous stories and perspectives. So this means all people to be involved, not just Indigenous people, not just Indigenous centers, but everybody. That through this, we can look at policies and practices, programs and student services that address the needs of Indigenous communities and people, build on the strengths and the foundation of Indigenous knowledge, involve Indigenous community, you know, in meaningful decision-making processes. And that for us, we have I believe, an ongoing need for professional development. And when I think back to 45 years plus, you know, I still think about a teaching from my grandfather. You know, he said, we can learn something new every day. And he said that in such a positive way that it was exciting, it was meaningful to learn something new every day. And this is what I find that has kept me inspired about decolonizing and indigenizing the Academy, is that I can learn something new every day, but we can do something important together, you know, to make sure that the Academy is respectful, responsible, and uses those ethical approaches for ensuring that all students receive good quality education that centers indigeneity in important ways. So, all my relations. So I do apologize for we're having a bit of trouble with moving these slides around. So back to you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Joanne. That is so informative and presented so well that you've covered my main questions around decolonizing. My main question was, what do faculty need to be mindful of in terms of decolonizing and indigenizing their courses, curriculum, and classrooms? And I think you've addressed all of those questions, or that major question, through your slides. And I'm being very aware of time here, and it's we've only got 15 minutes left. So I would like to forego our conversation, if that's okay with you, Joanne. and just allow some of the questions that have been presented in the chat, or individuals to ask particular questions. If you could just let Robert, myself, or Christine know, or flag it in the chat. Does anyone have a specific question for Joanne?
Also, I just want to mention, as we're now using the chat function, if you have suggestions, ideas to somebody's question, or want to respond to anything I've said too, please use the chat function.
No one has a question?
Dorothy, I wouldn't actually mind having a question. It's Ina Lee.
Oh, hi, Ina.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Archibald, first of all, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. At SFU, there's a lot of things that we could definitely be doing and that we don't. And I would be interested in hearing since you've been involved in these programs at UBC for such a long time, I'm wondering if you can reflect on what you would feel was one of the biggest successes in relation to moves towards decolonization, and what was needed to make that move. And the reason why, I guess the context of asking that is because oftentimes, especially under the TRC, our universities want to check the boxes of decolonization. And in many ways, it's kind of that, them being able to perform, woke settler, consciousness. And so I'd be interested in hearing, what would you see in your long experience as the biggest success, and what was needed to do that? I know you gave us some examples of what we need to do, but I'm just wondering if you can actually give us an example of what was actually needed to really push what you thought was the biggest move towards the decolonization of UBC, for example.
Okay. Probably having lots of patience, certainly, but I think of, I tried to, in the presentation, think of a course and a program. The other, and this is not on UBC, but what I've seen elsewhere, in universities, that I think a big change has been in prioritizing indigeneity, where many university strategic plans now have indigeneity as one of the core pillars, or however they, talk about their core priorities. That, it took many years for that to happen. I can recall being part of UBC when we first started strategic planning. I was on the committee. So the other important thing I learned is I needed to be at the table where some of these important decision-making areas were happening. If it wasn't me, having somebody else who was Indigenous or a non-Indigenous ally who could speak up, for indigeneity at those decision-making tables. And for a while, Indigenous considerations or engagement, was at the periphery of these strategic plans. But finally, we can see that, indigeneity is one of the core areas. And I think that's taken a lot of concerted effort for people, to become educated about why it's important or how it can be done, and to gather a critical mass of people within the university who can make that happen. Faculty members, staff, students, and working with key university leaders that finally, we have vice presidents, academic, and vice presidents, students, the president being very receptive and open to indigeneity. So, I believe that having that cooperative work, it cannot be one person one person can start things happening for sure, but it does take a concerted team or group effort. And also that there have been very important Indigenous community leaders over time who challenged university presidents, challenged other university leadership and asked them, why weren't they doing more? Why couldn't they have more Indigenous faculty? So that was important. And then, you know, making the space is important, and ensuring that we have more Indigenous students and faculty, that's all important. But if we do not change the system, we're not welcoming those Indigenous people into an environment where they can thrive, right? So again, what I think is needing systemic change. So does that mean developing new courses, changing admission policies so they're more holistic and flexible? It's not lowering standards. In fact, I think it makes them higher and more complex, but is more relevant. You know, we have to think about hiring policies. So I think all these things, it's not just one thing, although we can start with one thing, but it doesn't mean we stop at one thing.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just looking for Carolyn Roberts' question.
Hi, Dorothy.
Hi.
My question was, how do you address conflicting viewpoints within the academic classroom when you're the only Indigenous person in the classroom, when there's different worldviews and viewpoint on indigeneity?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Joanne. It's good to see you. It's Carolyn.
Yeah. Hi, Carolyn. Thanks. Good to see you too. Yeah, it is hard. You know, have experienced that a lot, being often, you know, all through my, you know, well, let's just use university, through my bachelor's, my master's, my PhD. I was the only Indigenous person in the course that was being offered during those times. And that the other thing is, if there's not conflict, there's nothing being said, right? So I always used to kind of speak up somewhere along the way and say, but gee, from an Indigenous perspective, why aren't we doing this? It took a lot of courage. I mean, I'm a rather shy person, actually. But there were times when I felt I needed to stand up to say something. And there were other times when it wasn't worth it, you know. And so, you know, being in a classroom where conflicting views and you're feeling it's not safe, you know, it's okay not to speak up. But what I would do, of course, is afterwards, I would speak to the faculty instructor and say how I was feeling and how that was unsafe, and where that's not acceptable. Because as a student, it's hard for you to speak up sometimes if you're feeling vulnerable, if you're feeling unsafe. But it's the instructors, the faculty members' responsibility to make sure there's a safe environment, because universities are talking about safe environments today, you know. So I think that's a way to say what you're feeling to the instructor, and to say that you hope something will be done about it. And it can be. And that's what I think happens in a lot of our situations. We may not be able to deal with it at the moment, but we're going to deal with it in some way. And sometimes the way we deal with it will have maybe longer impact. And then, you know, there are other times when we've had a sharing circle in the class, you know, and people get to talk about their feelings, and then you would find other people also felt uncomfortable, you know, who were non-Indigenous too. So, you know, again, there are ways to deal with, you know, that what you hope to do is create a safe environment where there can be differences of opinion, but we don't want you know, a person feeling that they're being assaulted.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Claudia Perez. Claudia?
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a question. I look for this one because I want to read it. But it's basically, Doctor, how a settler or non-Indigenous faculty can collaborate in indigenizing the academia without falling in unrespectful practices.
Okay. So sorry, was that about how Indigenous faculty could do that? Could you just...
Non-Indigenous faculty can help or support indigenizing the academia without falling in unrespectful practices.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, that's why in my presentation, you know, when I talked about do the hard work first, it's really preparing ourselves, you know, no matter who we are, you know, and by learning about some of the colonial history, or learning about Indigenous knowledge systems and how understanding those, and then figuring out how to bring those important things into our teaching practice. And, you know, I think that, you know, or I'll just say we do things with a good heart and a good mind. Like today, Marnie opened up with some good words to help guide us in how we hear and how we see and, you know, how we speak. And that's important, creating that safe environment and creating relationships. So, you know, somebody who's learning, who's interested, that's important. But remembering that it takes time. It takes time to get ourselves ready to engage with indigeneity. And some people may say, I don't have a lot of time. I have too much pressure. I have too many things to do. You know, but this is an important one that I think not only helps us be better teachers, but I think it helps us be better people. You know, we have to think about how we treat others, how we treat the environment, and all those teachings come from Indigenous knowledge systems. And then I think having, you know, a group, when I talked about our instructors in NITEP getting together, where we can talk about our approaches, talk about our challenges, and wonder, would this be a good thing to do? So having, you know, a group around you who is interested in doing, you know, this important work and sharing ideas on how to do it in a respectful way. You know, so sometimes going a little slower is a little better. And I find too, we're going to make mistakes. Goodness, I make lots of mistakes, even though I hate making mistakes. But I've heard elders say, yes, well, then you can sincerely apologize and say, next time I'm going to do better. You know, and with that, there is a next time, and then you have to figure out, how am I going to do better, right? But when we're ready to do these things, there's usually people around who would be there to help us.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Okay, the next question is from Dan Clegg. Dan, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me here?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Archibald. Nice to meet you. I was just wondering about something really similar about professors who might want to approach using story as a...
2 o'clock.
Sorry?
No, sorry, my computer.
Being open to story as a epistemological, pedagogical kind of methodology, but on the other hand, being wary of appropriation on the part of non-Indigenous scholars. Is that something that should be left alone if scholars or teachers don't have traditions of story work of their own? or is that something that would be useful for professors to approach cautiously? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question, because that's my heart is, in Indigenous story work, how to use Indigenous stories for education, both traditional and life experience stories. So part of what I tried to share today was about getting ready to do this work in decolonizing, indigenizing. When we think of Indigenous stories, it's the same way. We need to get story ready in order to work in a respectful, responsible, ethical, reciprocal, reverent way with stories. And there are things we can do too, where we learn, establishing relationships with Indigenous people who want to share their thoughts about how stories can be used. There are, many books and articles now about Indigenous stories, so there are many resources available. And, I think that's the important part, is getting ourselves ready to take the time to learn and to question. The questions are, what are cultural protocols that are to be used with stories, and recognizing the diversity of Indigenous cultures and stories. It's, one thing might be good for Stalo, but it might not work for Haida people, for example, or Secwepemc, or Silk people. So we need to ask the questions about, what are the protocols, what are the purposes of stories, and how might we use them in ways that are respectful. And then also thinking about, what stories would we not use that are more sacred and private. So I think being able to identify these questions, and then getting ready by reading a lot, all the resources that exist about stories, and then having chats with people who use stories, and then sharing some ideas about that. And I think that this center that's putting on this Zoom session today is a good starting place too, if you don't have other sources that you can go to.
Thank you so much.
Okay, the next question that was posted to me is from Sven Robinson, but I read it and I don't see a question there. Are you there, Sven? Did you have a direct question for Dr. Archibald?
Yes, thanks very much, and thank you for the presentation. My question was really around what level of support is there currently within the British Columbia post-secondary education system for Indigenous languages, because of course we know, as I said in my chat question, how absolutely essential this is for indigeneity, the survival and thriving of Indigenous languages. To what extent, Dr. Archibald, is this being supported at this time?
Well, of course it varies, across the different post-secondary institutes in the province, where there are some that have a quite vibrant Indigenous language program, like UBC Indigenous Languages has a number of courses that they've been offering for a few years in partnership with Indigenous communities. And then we have other post-secondaries like the Anauken Center that has been working with UBC Okanagan and other post-secondary institutes, NVIT, in offering some Syilx or Okanagan language courses. And the I think it's now been approved, but the advanced education worked with a number of universities and colleges in the province to develop an Indigenous language fluency degree, where there have been Indigenous languages, especially taught in Indigenous post-secondary institutes based in Indigenous communities. They've been offering Indigenous language courses, and some of these others have had year 1, year 2. So there is a mechanism where these courses can lead into a degree, and it's about fluency. It's not just about awareness of language. So I think that that particular degree program has been approved now, and it took a few years to get it working, but I cannot answer how well it is being resourced. So that question goes to advanced education.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Now, I hate to be the timekeeper here, but we're at 2:06 right now. And I'm wondering if, Joanne, are you willing to field one more question, and then we can move to closing?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm not leaving till just before 3 to get onto the golf course. So sure.
Okay,
And,
that's great.
and it'd be great if people had other thoughts. I love reading the chat comments, but if you had other information to share with others, please do so.
Billy Cohen from UBC Okanagan is saying, when there's a healthy cultural and ecological diversity, again is when Thunderbird will be soaring. That's the potential. I'm thankful to Dr. Joanne and Indigenous story workers for giving us.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Bill. Well, Dr. Bill's a fluent Silk speaker there. So Dr. Bill has been very involved in teaching Indigenous language and education in the Okanagan area for quite a while now.
There's another question here. I'm not sure if it's Gina. Gina, are you there?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you can see me or hear me. Sorry. I'm just in like a busy PE office. My question, I'm doing my master's right now, and I'm trying to look at the idea of like bringing in community and relationships and including that in assessment. And so I'm just wondering, because there's so many things that kind of parallel Indigenous teachings, like how I can better incorporate it, or like what are some resources or places like I can go to look for those things.
Was that PE at university or are you in high school?
Oh, my headphones fell out. It's in high school.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot is being talked about today about, you know, place-based education and being able to, you know, go outside to be able to, you know, spend time in nature and hike and walk. There have been different camps, like survival camps, where, you know, Indigenous people have taken students out for these experiences, you know, where, you know, there are, even in the city, there are different, you know, places, Stanley Park, you know, others to go to, which is using, you know, physical education. And of course, there are different games, you know, that Indigenous traditional games, current contemporary games that have been identified as resources. So, you know, I can't exactly name a particular curriculum resource that you could use. These are different approaches and strategies, but, you know, perhaps we have still a lot of people here in the Zoom who could give some ideas about teaching PE that addresses indigeneity.
The next question comes from Suk Padam. Do you want to just state your question? Or you have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Suk.
Hi. My question was, I was just going through the University of BC action plan for incorporating Indigenous views and initiatives. And there, I came across a video, I just watched it yesterday, and it was about the UN DRIP and how UBC was the first university in Canada, perhaps the world, to embrace and complement the policies of the UN DRIP. Do you have any thoughts on that as to whether any progress or change will occur from this?
Well, I think it's wonderful that that's occurred. Now, an important part of all of these, really, nice and especially nice looking strategic plans that are in fancy booklets, etc., is that there has to be some sort of implementation plan or accountability, where there is a group. I was involved with UBCs one time with an implementation committee, and we continued to gather and take a look at some of the approaches and what was recommended, and then we were able to bring together those in the university who could deal with some of the issues that needed to be fixed in a way. And I think that was so important that, we have to have this accountability and see, is there an implementation group that takes a look at what's happening and then reports on what is done, and reports in a public way, like on the website, to be able to say, this is what we did, this is what we tried to do, this is what we haven't done, but that we still mean to do that. And I think it's really up to us, though, to be able to ask the questions to those who are involved in the implementation. I think it's too easy to sit back and be critical about these plans. We need to be able to criticize. At the same time, we have to get involved and do things, because these plans, really are meant for all of us. It just isn't meant, for senior leadership to make sure it gets done. The same applies to the province, right? They accepted UNDRIP. Well, what are we doing to make the province accountable, to get a sense of how are they implementing UNDRIP?
Well, we're getting close to 2:15 here, and I think the thing that's really stands out for me today from listening to Dr. Joanne and to the various questions grappling with the idea of how to decolonize and indigenize. And I always come back to this, that the Indigenous and settler conversation or dialogue doesn't have to be in conflict. Certainly there's discomfort. And in the discomfort, we have to acknowledge that that is part of the growth process of the building relationships that we have got to do in, as Joanne said, doing the hard work. It's part of the hard work. And just as I was sitting here, I was thinking in so many ways we're having to combat some of the old stereotypes, that project Indigenous peoples as we're either warriors or we're these wonderful environmental peoples, who just live in harmony and balance with everything. So people are a little surprised when we come out with some critical thinking that has to do with our Indigenous knowledge systems. So I would really encourage everyone just to continue on in the dialogue, embrace your discomfort, and don't run away from it, and that's how I would like to just finish up. And I would like to just honor, again, this is an adaptation of our protocols. Usually, as I said at the beginning, we would present a gift to Joanne, but I've already given that gift. So I would like to play the Women's Warrior Song and ask everyone to stand to honor this woman who has represented us as a warrior woman in the Academy. and she's represented us with such grace and with such dignity. Robert, can you start the song, please? And I have my fan and drum always. Thanks, John, Joanne, for being with us today.
Thanks. Thanks.
Let's just hope we can get the technology to work.
Maybe you'll have to sing without the music, Dorothy. Your voice is better anyway.
The equality song was made to show that we can stand together as one, as people, all races, no matter where you come from. I gifted people to show that their voice matters and we can stand together as people.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.